Malolele and welcome everyone. Malolele, sorry, we're having some technical difficulties here in the background. Looks like Twitter was having a slow start there. Just wanted to make sure we were live there. We welcome everyone to another live digital kava session here on the Polynesian Eyes podcast. This is Tuafale coming in live from Las Vegas, Nevada, the entertainment capital of the world. Mr. Aotearoa is tied up with family activities, and so it will be a Lone Ranger tonight for myself. It's been a busy few weeks, a lot of traveling and so forth. So we've missed, I believe, a week. We didn't have a live digital kava session last week, but we did upload new episodes onto the Polynesian Eyes podcast playlist, both on YouTube and also on Apple Podcasts, Amazon Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and all the different podcast platforms out there. So today we're going to do a spiritual live digital kava session. We're a little behind on a handful of our episodes where we have a focus on the creation account. We also have one on a evangelical pastor reading through the Book of Mormon. And so we're going to focus on a spiritual episode this evening. You know, a lot of people are may be thinking, hey, why are we doing like religious stuff? It's because at the Dakava sessions, you come in and you learn and you discuss all things, right? Our ancestors knew that there is a physical component to us, but there's also a spiritual aspect, and it's very important to take into account the spiritual and the temporal aspects of the reality that we live in. And in the reality that we live in, the Christian religion plays a important role in the Polynesian culture. And I know there's a lot of people out there who also say, hey, you know, Christianity is the white man's religion. And why are we talking about Jesus, the white God? Well, it's because our ancestors were familiar with God, Jehovah, prior to Christianity coming to the Polynesian Empire. And also, you know, re- Christianity is not a quote unquote white man's religion because it originates from Northern Africa and it went through a lot of those areas before it went into Europe. So it's really important you take that into account, you know, not get carried away with these academics and these quote unquote people who have unresolved trauma, as we like to say here in the Polynesian Eyes podcast, that they can't see things clearly for not only our history as Polynesians, but also the spiritual aspect of our culture and who we are as a people. So, we're going to continue our series on the creation account. It's been interesting. There is a lot of activity online I've seen, especially in the LDS uh, podcast space. There's a lot of discussions on the creation, primarily because this year there is a focus on the Old Testament and going through Genesis and also through the Pearl of Great Price. And so there is a renewed focus on the creation account. Obviously, this is something that's important to us on the Polynesian Eyes podcast because we have a series solely dedicated to the creation account. It's something that I have spent a significant amount of time studying and pondering and have developed a unique perspective on how to interpret um, the creation account in the Bible and in the book of Moses. We'll do a quick recap, kind of reviewing. I think we finished on day 3. So we're going to do days 4, 5, and 6. And we're just going to try and plow through it. And this is really important because days 4, 5, and 6 will get you through Moses chapter 2. It will also get you through Genesis chapter 1. And then we're going to transition into Moses 3 and Genesis 2 and kind of lay out an argument. There is the dual creation problem that many academics and other people who study the creation account that say there are two separate creation accounts and that they're conflicting. We take the position here on the Polynesianized podcast that it is a singular account and that you need to understand how those two accounts flow and are connected to each other, um, to be able to understand and interpret correctly. We draw heavily from the concept of how to properly interpret a revelation in the scriptures or any type of revelation or data set. And, just like you do polling, there's all kinds of polls out there for politics, for consumers, any kind of research that happens out there. You don't just jump in and look at the data. You really have to understand the questions that are driving the responses in the data. And that when you understand the question that's being asked, then you will have the capacity to properly interpret the answer that's being given. And that's something that, you know, I read that Joseph Smith is a huge believer that that was something that is critical. And I have applied that into my approach into revelation, whether it's personal or through the scriptures or listening to other people sharing their revelatory experiences, is to really understand the question that's being asked that's tied to the revelation that's quote unquote being received. And that really just gives it a lot of structure. It gives you context on how to properly interpret the revelation in front of you. Because really, the truth is, when you receive a revelation, just like any data point, without an additional data point or a origin, context, you can interpret the revelation and the data in a million different ways. And so I've seen a lot of podcasts lately, um, Ward Radio, handful of others that have come up with some interpretations of the creation account, and we're going to continue with ours. So, with that being said, bring it up here, and it's our um, we always take our time to recognize our paying members on the channel, Malo, Mel. And I thought about you the other day, Mel, because we were watching a video on a presentation of Tongan history, I want to say about 10 years ago. And one of the presenters, who's also been a guest on the Polynesianized podcast, Daniela Fale, or Maui Tekelangi as the handle that he goes by, he mentioned that in the past, around the time, I believe, if I remember correctly, of Tuitatui or Momo, that there was an effort to revitalize the canoe building technology, and that it was one of the representatives from Tokelau that won this, you know, search for new technology in the canoe building, and that the new technology that came out of Tokelau was canoe building using multiple planks or multiple uh, cuts of a tree, because traditionally the traditional way was a whole tree and carving it out into one of the outriggers. But one of the technologies that came out of Tokelau was the development and the usage of building double outriggers using multiple pieces of wood from different trees, which was a huge advancement in the technology. So made me think of you, Mel. So appreciate the support. Maybe we'll do a reaction to some of those accounts there. But once again, thank you very much to your support, and it's greatly appreciated. Before we go in further, since we brought up here Mel as a paying member of the channel. If you have a question or a comment that you want highlighted, please use the super chats. We do go out of our way to recognize the super chats. Or if you are a paying member of the channel, we give you guys priority in recognizing your comments in there. So, with that being said, we'll jump right back into it. Let me see if I can just make this maybe a little smaller. We'll make that a little bit smaller um, for visibility purposes. But we're in the creation account. We're gonna try and plow through. This is part 8. I think we have 8 videos in that playlist, but we're gonna try and get through days 4, 5, and 6 um, as quickly as possible and walk through. We'll do quick review, and I think this is important. This is a concept that I think you will not find anywhere else besides here at the Polynesianized podcast. I want to get rid of this banner here real quick because it's also getting in the way. And so it's a thought process or an approach to the creation account that I do not believe anyone else in the world has kind of expressed, and this is something unique. This is a new, unique perspective from the Polynesianized podcast on what we have coined as the godly creative pattern. And what is the godly creative pattern? And it is built around these 3 terms: make, create, and formed. Now, typically, when we read the scriptures and we read the account of the creation, we kind of use these terms interchangeably, right? Like we say, make is the same thing as create. I've heard a few people say that, form might be a little bit more physical, which we agree to here. Um, but we have specific definitions given to each of these terms. Now, when we say we, I mean, one of the big things that we focus on in our discussions on the scriptures is to try and have the scriptures speak for themselves and allow the spirit to kind of guide that teaching or that experience that you're having with the scriptures, rather than trying to self-impose your pre-existing ideas or beliefs into the scriptures, and therefore you're basically telling the scriptures to confirm what you already think you know and believe, but instead to come to the scriptures and say, I do not know everything, and that I am coming to the scriptures to try and learn something new. So that's something that's really important. The second thing that's really important, because of our LDS background, obviously, that's the tilt that we have. But a lot of these patterns are still visible, even if you don't believe in the LDS church. When you look at the Bible, these patterns are visible as well. So it's very applicable, even if you're just looking at the Bible by itself. However, we do make an exception for the book of Moses, and especially chapter 1 in the book of Moses. And the reason why this is important is, as I mentioned earlier, knowing the question is critical in order for you to understand the revelation. I would dare to say that if you don't understand the question that's being asked, you will never understand the answer or the revelation that's been given to its full extent. So, sorry, I'm going to resit here. Kind of started just sitting down and super comfortable. We were having some technical issues trying to work through the internet before we went live. So, with that being said, we're going to start with the term make. And I'm going to show where we get these definitions from. So like we didn't just sit here and make up these definitions. We saw how they're used in the scriptures, and I'll give more context. I'm trying to give as much context as we get into this. We take the approach that, apart from when you go through Genesis 1 and 2 or Moses 2 and 3, Moses is not having a vision. we are taking the position that God is speaking to Moses and Moses is writing it down. So basically, it's a dictation exercise where God is speaking to Moses and Moses is writing down what God is saying on how the creation came about. So um, this idea that Moses was having a vision and that he was using the the scientific knowledge of his day to answer his questions, um is, to me, we don't really buy into that, because it's quite clear that God is speaking and Moses is writing down what God is speaking word for word. So that's one part. The second part is really the significance and the contribution that Joseph Smith does or gives us is he gives Moses chapter 1, which is a chapter preceding to Genesis 1, where it says, in the beginning, right? In the Bible, it starts with that in Genesis 1 1. However, Joseph Smith gives the revelation that there is a whole interaction between Moses and God before the revelation of the creation account in Genesis 1 begins. Now, why is that critical? Obviously, for what I shared with you earlier, that understanding the question is pivotal. You will find the question that's being asked or answered in Moses chapter 1 in the Pearl of Great Price. In fact, you'll find that Moses asked the question three different times because God kind of calibrates his question every two times before Moses asks the question that is appropriate and relevant to the will of God. So that's also another important lesson to learn. Sometimes, we're asked to knock and seek and ask, but we also have to be sure that we're asking and knocking for the right things. So in it's as awkward or as counterintuitive as that may sound, asking for what you should be asking is a critical piece of the revelatory process. Anyways, with that being said, really important, Moses chapter 1 actually gives us the definitions of make and create. And we leverage what God is saying in order to understand what those terms mean. So, you know what? Maybe it would be helpful if I pull it up. Um, Let me put it this way. So we're going to go to Moses 125 just so that everyone can kind of see that. Let's go share screen. Moses 1, we'll share this. All right. So this is from Moses 1 after God kind of brings up Moses. We walk through this whole lead up and the experience. It's actually a very unique and rare experience that Moses has. Really encourage those who haven't seen those episodes, but we take the interpretation that Moses is literally, people say he's caught up to a high mountain, just like Nephi and many other prophets in the Bible. Moses, we take the position that when they're caught up, they're actually caught up not to a mountaintop here on earth, but to a mountaintop in the spirit world. And that's where they're having a revelatory experience. Then Moses falls back down. He proclaims what he's learned. And then um, God, in interacting with Moses, gives what we take as the definition of the term make. And it says here, and we take that definition from Moses 1, verse 25, by referencing how God uses the term make. And it says, and calling upon the name of God, he beheld his glory again. This was Moses, for it was upon him, and he heard a voice saying, Blessed art thou, Moses, for I, that's God, the Almighty, have chosen thee, and thou shalt be made. And this is important. That's the term. That's the term we're looking for at right there, right? Made, which is make. For thou shalt be made stronger than many waters, for they shall obey thy command. as if thou wert God. Okay. Now remember, this is the experience that Moses is having talking with God before the creation account is dictated to him. So we look at the term made. What is that? The term made is tied to the fact that God chose Moses and says that thou shalt be made, meaning it hasn't happened, but God hasn't happened in a linear sense, but God has declared it with his mouth that Moses shall be made stronger than many waters. So the interpretation that we take onto the term made, based on how God uses it in talking to Moses, is that made is directly tied to when God speaks. It's when God speaks something and says that it will happen because he is God. That's what makes him God, is that when he says something will happen, it, even though in our sense or understanding of time that it hasn't happened in a linear sense, but because he is God, it is as good as if it has already happened. Just like Jesus, before Jesus died on the cross and made the atonement a reality, people who lived before Jesus were receiving the blessings of the atonement before it, quote unquote, happened. Because why? Because God made those blessings a reality by speaking it. The fact that that God the Father said that Jesus will die and that he will pay for your sins, it was as good as gold and you take it to the bank. That's what's happening here. What's happening here is God tells Moses, you shall be made stronger than many waters. Remember, this is before he goes to Egypt and he does all of those miracles, a lot of it to do with water, right? And what God is saying is, I have declared it and it will happen as if you were God. And so that's where we get that definition. And let's come back here in the first part of the godly creative pattern is that the term make is when God authorizes something to happen. It's when God the Father speaks it. That's when something is made. That doesn't mean that it has happened per se in the linear fashion, but because God made it or God the Father said it, that's what has been declared and it gives purpose. It's kind of like when you make something, right? When you're gonna do a car, or manufacture a car or software or whatever, you start with a purpose, a meaning behind it. That's what the make portion is God the Father declares with his mouth the purpose, the meaning, and the outcome of why he has said what he said. So that's what we take. So whenever we see the word made or make in the creation account, we interpret that as God the Father speaking the authorization for the creation. And we'll get to the create term in a little bit, that God has given his authorization for that to move forward, for that purpose to materialize spiritually and physically, if that makes sense. We'll jump into the create. So we did the make, that's God the Father authorizing it. Create is when Jesus or Jehovah takes what God the Father has made or declared or purpose that God has declared and creates the spiritual manifestation of what God has made previously. So that's the first transition. Make, God speaks it. Create, Jehovah or Jesus brings a spiritual manifestation of what God the Father had made previously, right? And so where do we kind of get that definition? We actually get that definition from Moses chapter 1 verse 8, and it's really important. I'm trying to kind of fly through a lot of these concepts, but it really has to do with Let me see here. Why aren't you coming to the stage before presenting? Oh, I got to remove this guy first. Okay. All right. I'm going to cover this real quick. So we take the position in here in Moses 1. Moses is caught up to the spirit world, not to a mountain. He's caught up to the spirit world, and we covered this extensively. We go through the terms, we walk through the processes. We even go through where Moses puts his eyes to tell you where he is. Um, and really, Moses in the beginning of this chapter is caught up into the spirit world. And when he says these verses right here, verses 1 through 8, or chapter 1, verse 8 in the book of Moses, in the Pearl of Great Price, it says, "And it came to pass that Moses looked and beheld the world." And this is a term that we like, spirit world. This is not the earth. And we kind of go into the details that he's looking at the spirit world upon which he was created. Okay, we dive into the details. He doesn't say where he was born, he doesn't say where he lives, but he looks into the world on which he was created. And Moses beheld the world and the ends thereof, and all the children of men which are and which were created. Of the same he greatly marveled and wondered. So there is other scripture, and maybe we should just go to it, because people say, "Ah, Tua, you're kind of over reading this, blah, blah, blah." We're just going to go to it. It is further confirmed later in, so this would be Genesis 2, and it would, which would be Moses 3. So here's the key terms here. And this is where it's kind of laid out. Remember, this is Moses 3, this is Genesis 2, after the 6 creative periods have been explained. And God is, remember, we take the position, God is dictating or talking to Moses. And he says, "And every plant of the field, it was in the earth, and every herb of the field before it grew. For I, the Lord God, created," there's the term, "all things of which I have spoken spiritually." That's, look, see how the terms are tied together? Created is tied to spiritual things. Okay. And so that's what we're looking at, is created. The term created is specifically tied to spiritual creation. So when you say creation, we take the interpretation that it's a spiritual um, process going on before they were naturally upon the earth, right? So naturally is more physical, more temporal. "For I, the Lord God, had not caused it to rain upon the face of the earth, and I, the Lord God, had created all the children of men, and not yet man to till the ground. For in heaven," see the term? The term is consistent. You will see that God uses this term consistently in the aspect of the godly creative pattern that I kind of expressed to you. So there is much more that's tied to this. We'll probably get into these verses in a future episode, but really just want to kind of, the point of going there was to show it's not just that one verse that we're tying our interpretation to, and that there's actually a consistency in the use of the term in the creation account, and even God himself utilizes that consistency of, make is when God speaks it, create is when Jehovah or Jesus has a spiritual process to bring to pass spiritually what God has made or authorized, if that makes sense. All right, so form, the last part of the godly creative pattern, and we'll just come back here real quick. Um, let's see if this is a little bit better here. Just moving around so you guys can see the full text there. And so form. So what is form? Remember, we looked at it earlier that it's naturally, that's the physical part. And we take that from Moses chapter 3, verse 7. Um, let's just go to the verse here, right? So formation or forming is when it physically happens. Let's come back to chapter 3, verses 7. So remember, in verse 5, he talks about the spiritual and that everything he told Moses previously is all spiritual. But now he's going to talk more about what the form is. And I, the Lord God, formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And man became a living soul. And this is important. In the restored gospel of Jesus Christ, the term soul has a specific concept tied to it. And that concept is spirit and body is what makes a soul, right? Now, that's a little bit of a nuance of the restored gospel. But the point is, earlier he just says, create, create, create man. That's all spiritual. Then he comes here and he says, hey, I formed man and put in his spirit, breathed into him the breath of life. Then he became a living soul, right? Then it says the first flesh upon the earth, the first man also. So the first flesh and the first man was Adam. Nevertheless, all things were before created, but spiritually were they created right here. So here we go. Spiritually, they were created and made according to my word. So once again, we think there's a very strong case to be made that the godly creative pattern right here of make, create, and form, that there's a very strong case to be made for that. So that's the crash course on that before we get into the other part. So we'll move on. So we'll just kind of quickly go through some of um the interpretations of and okay, here's a great question here, comment here from Maria. Maria says Jehovah is not Jesus. Jehovah is Elohim. Is Yahweh is Rapha. Jesus Christ is the son of Jehovah, Elohim, Yahweh, Rapha. Are you that? No, that's a great point. The thing I would add to you, Maria, is look into the Hebrew naming convention of in the creation account in Genesis 1. There is Elohim, which is plural, which is technically the correct translation for that word is gods. It's plural. And then when you go into Moses 2 or to Genesis 2, and right at about verse 3, there is a transition to Elohim, but it's or to God, to the term God that's closer to the term Jehovah. So we take a different interpretation to that, Maria. We take the interpretation that Elohim is God the Father and that Jehovah is God the Son. So that's kind of our interpretation on that. But fair question. But we're not going to dive into that into detail. But I can understand the point that you're coming with, Maria. Okay. So day one, the quick synopsis on our interpretation of day one. Day one is a figurative explanation, not of a creative process, but of a description of the state of the spirits and the spirit world at the very beginning of the creation account. And the terms that you will use, and you'll see this in the Hebrew terms, is tohu vavohu, and it's the ways to describe the waters and the deep, right? We take a definition that the waters, in a sense, are representative of all of us spiritually living in the spirit world before the creation account, before we came down. That the water is, in a sense, a representation of us, but and somewhat of the chaos that we were in. But the deep or Tohu vavohu, the deep is representative of a secret that someone is trying to hide from God the Father, right? So there's a reason why before the creation continues, um, God the Father stops and his spirit hovers over the face of the water, right? It hovers over the face of the water, and he says, and I do it because I am God. So he's looking and he's seeing the chaos that's in front of him, and he sees the deep. He sees the secret that's trying to be kept from him. And what does he do? He causes darkness to come up. Now, it's a very strange way to express this because darkness is usually tied to bad, evil. But in this sense, God causes the darkness to come up. The interpretation we take of that is because God looks down, he can see everything that is happening in the spirit world, in the water, and the secret combination or whatever that's trying to be hidden from him. He causes the darkness to come up and it acts like a veil where God can see everything that they're doing, but they cannot see everything that God is doing, right? And that the night and the day that's being described there is kind of like a separation or a divide because God says, let there be light. And then the gods look and the light is good. And they separate the light from the night, the day from the night. And if you notice, the day and the night here is capitalized because I believe that that's kind of discussing that God is separating the dark, the night, those who weren't as obedient, potentially those who were, in the deep, holding with trying to hide something from God, versus the day, or those who were obedient to God and were following God. So that's kind of the concept there. Here's an interesting question here from DHL Mike. Are you saying God didn't create the waters? Well, these waters here, DHL or Mike, they're figurative. They're speaking about beings or people that existed before the creation account happens. That's a great term. So here's the other thing, Mike. In Genesis 1, when it says in the beginning, when the interpretation that we take is that in the beginning means the beginning of an idea or a thought and not necessarily the beginning of all things, if that makes sense. If you look at the term in the beginning in Hebrew, there is room to say that it is the beginning of a thought or an idea, and that term is used in other areas in the Bible that gives that room for that interpretation. So we don't prescribe to the creation ex nihilo, meaning something out of nothing. We don't prescribe to that thought, but in this case, this water is not quote unquote waters as in the water that we're used to. And Mike says, sounds like a private interpretation. Yeah, I mean, everything's private interpretation. Everyone has their own thoughts and thoughts from it. So that's fair. Yeah, private interpretation, but I'd be happy to put it up against any other interpretation out there, especially when you zoom out at the whole picture that we're going to walk through. While we're at it, hey, Alpha Omega Malo, appreciate it from Maui. Appreciate the shout out. So, with that being said, this is a separation of good actors and bad actors, is kind of the way we see it, and that there is a separation in that. So, that's day one, right? So, day two, now this is where things kind of get a little interesting. So, one of the things that we do that's really important from our perspective on how to understand the navigation, and we're using these visuals to help us. But when you jump into day two, and there's a little nuance there, but when you jump into day two, you notice that we're getting closer to an actual creation or formation process here. because everything starts with water right here. Um, I can't really zoom into show, but on point one, let me go into a different view here so it's a little bit bigger. So on the number one, we just start with water, right? Then we go to point two. On day two, God inserts a firmament, and the firmament separates the waters above the firmament from the waters below the firmament. So we see that there's waters above, there's a firmament, and then there's the waters, right? That's the naming convention that happens there. Then, as you continue on day two, the namings change. Then, and this is really important, just like the darkness was called night, right? Yeah, some people are asking if we can make it bigger. We're gonna try. That's about as big as I can get it for now, unfortunately. For those who are joining on their phones. Um, so it separates, and everything's called waters above, waters below, and then there's a firmament. Names are important, just like we saw the dark was called night, right? And the light was called day. And we look at all the prophets. Abraham was first Abram, then he becomes Abraham, right? We look at Simon becomes Peter. I forgot Paul's first name, but he was someone else. Then he gets called Paul. So names is making. That's what making is, because God, when God declares you a new name, he's giving you a new purpose. So Saul, appreciate it, Omega, is Saul. So you notice that we start off with waters, then you insert a firmament, and then it goes from waters, firmament to waters again. Then God names things again. And you'll notice on day two, the firmament gets a new name, and the waters below the firmament get a new name, and it's the great waters. But the waters above the firmament, the names don't change. That name doesn't change. And that's going to become very important. Um, so that's something that's really important to understand, is that the naming convention happens, right? And so when you get a name, there's a change and a purpose. It's being made in the godly created pattern that we mentioned earlier. Okay. So at the end of day two, we have waters which are above the heavens, and then below the heavens, the waters below are given a new name called the great waters. So in point number three, that's the naming of the different spheres or zones or whatever you want to call it at the end of day two. Next, in day three, right? So once again, the end of day two, we got the three different names. On day three, we notice that the great waters are gathered. Then the great waters are the waters below the heaven. They're gathered to one side, and then the dry land is brought up on the other side. And that's at point number two here. The great waters are gathered. Then, once the great waters are gathered and the dry land appears, then they get a new name. The great waters below the heaven are now called the sea, and the dry land is now named earth. But you notice the waters that were above the firmament, or the above that were above heaven, that name doesn't change. That name of the waters remains the same. So that's important. So at the end of day three, this is what everything looks like. Waters above the firmament that's in the middle, and then the waters that were below are gathered to one side. Dry land comes up. Then God calls the gathered waters the sea, and the dry land he renames earth. Once again, he's making things. He's declaring, as these new names are being given and these actions are happening, that's the making. That's the first part of the creative process. Things have to be made, before they can be created. And then only after they've been created, then they can be formed. So once again, when you're looking through the creation account, those three terms do not mean the same thing. They mean three different processes of the godly creative pattern, as we've coined here on the Polynesian Eyes podcast. All right, let's see what's next. So that's where we are. Waters from top to bottom. Waters never changed its name. The firmament went from firmament to heaven. The waters below heaven went from waters to the great waters to now they're all collected to one side and called the sea. And then the earth is on one side, or the dry land on one side, that's now named earth. So I believe that's where we are right now. So we're going to go into day 4 on the creative process here. So this is where we are. We're going to try, with that context, with that background, we're now going to try and get through days 4, 5, and 6. So that's kind of the goal here. All right. So we've kind of walked through this. This is just a summary of what we discussed. So we'll skip this guy and go straight into the scriptures themselves. So this is Moses, or Genesis 1 verses 14 through 16, or Moses 2 verses 14 through 16. And I'm going to read the Moses side. And as you can see, I've highlighted in the yellow the differences between the Moses verses versus the verses in Genesis. So we're going to let's do some a little bit different here so I can see this a little bit better. There we go. Put myself on that side. So verses 14 through 16, it says, and I, God, said, he's making, he's speaking, right? So this is making. Let there be lights in the firmament of heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. And let them be for lights in the firmament of the heaven, right? So the firmament of the heaven, to give light upon the earth. And it was so. And I, God, made 2 great lights, right? So he's making it. The greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. And the greater light was the sun, and the lesser light was the moon, and the stars also were made even according to my word. So once again, the making of things is tied to God's word. So what does that mean? So this is kind of like the visual, right? So he said he made the greater light, the lesser light, and all the stars in the firmament of heaven. So remember, these are the waters that are above the firmament of heaven, or above heaven, right? So the sun, moon, and stars are in that middle portion, in the firmament of heaven. That's where it's put. That's where they're put, the sun, the moon, and the stars. And what is their purpose? The sun is to give light during the day. The moon is to give light during the night. And then the stars and the sun and the moon are for signs and for seasons. And they basically are the clock, right? It's the clock by which everything can be measured and tracked, which is what our human beings for thousands of years have done. So this is kind of the visual representation of verses 14 through 16 there. Verses 17 through 19. And I, God, set them in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth, and the sun to rule over the day, and the moon to rule over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And I, God, saw that all the things which I had made, what he had declared, was good. And the evening and the morning were the 4th day. So that's the end of the 4th day right there. So the 4th day is done. This is what it looks like, right? So you notice nothing in the waters, nothing in the heavens, nothing on the earth, nothing in the sea. All right, let's go to day 5 here, right? And I, God, said, once again, he's going to declare, he's going to make, let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that have life, and fowl which may fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven. Now, this is important. It says, let the waters bring forth life abundantly, the moving creature that have life, and the fowl may fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven. Now, let's go back. Let's go back here. God says in the waters. Remember, there's only one place now that has water that's still called waters, and that's the waters above the firmament of heaven. And it says, all life, but then the fowl are going to fly in the firmament of heaven. They're not going to fly on earth or in the air on earth. It says in the firmament of heaven. So this is above, right? So this is important because that's what the scripture is saying, where the life is coming out of the waters and where the fowl will fly. Okay. So let's come back here. And it says, and I, God, created great whales and every living creature that moveth. Remember, created. After he made in this verse 20, right? He made the living creatures in verse 20. Then in verse 21, he's creating them. And I, God, created great whales and every living creature that moveth, which the waters, once again, the waters above the firmament, brought forth abundantly after their kind, and every winged fowl after his kind. And I, God, saw that all things which I had created, these is spiritual, were good. So he creates all of them. They're multiplying, they're growing in the waters. Then in verse 22, he says, and I, God, blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the, look, you see here, sea, and let fowl multiply in the earth. So this is kind of the interpretation we're taking here. So he creates them spiritually all up in the waters, says the fowls can fly in the heavens. Then he blesses them that they may multiply and that they may fill the sea and fly and multiply in the earth. All right. And that's the end of the 5th day. So this is the summary of that. So the summary is, in the waters above, God makes living creatures. God creates whales and every living creature that has life, and fowl that flies above the earth in the open firmament of heaven. So you see, earth is down at the bottom. And it says that when he creates the fowls in the waters above, that they're going to fly above the earth in the firmament of heaven. Right? And then God commands all creatures in the waters above to multiply and fill the waters of the sea. So they're multiplying spiritually so that they will eventually fill the sea below. But they haven't gone down there. They've been made or told or commanded to multiply so that they could at some point fill the sea, right? And then in the sea, it says, created spiritual creatures with life from waters above with the firmament to fill the sea in the future. Same thing with the earth, right? So we kind of do a spiritual sphere from the firmament of heaven and above. So from the firmament of heaven and above, that's a spiritual world, and physical sphere from the firmament of heaven and below. So the firmament of heaven is kind of like the middle ground, where the spiritual and the temporal are engaging with each other. That's kind of like the point of tension, or the transition point, so to speak. All right. We'll continue here. And it says in Moses 2, verses 24, 25, or Genesis 1, 24, 25, and I, God, said, let the earth, remember, now we're talking about at the bottom, bring forth the living creature after his kind, cattle, creeping things and beasts of the earth after their kind, and it was so. God is making these things. He's just speaking it. He hasn't made created them spiritually. He hasn't formed them physically. Verse 25, and I, God, made, right? So he's just speaking, giving them purpose. He's making them, made the beasts of the earth after their kind, and cattle after their kind, and everything which creepeth upon the earth after his kind. And I, God, saw that all these things were good. So he hasn't done anything but make them or declare their purposes, right? And he hasn't formed them physically. That's another key. So, Moses 2, verses 26 and 28, or Genesis 1, 26 through 28, same verses in the Bible. And it says, and I, God, said unto mine only begotten, which was with me from the beginning. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Let us make man, make, right? That's his declaration of his word, in our image, after our likeness. And it was so. And I, God, said, let them have dominion over the, see right here, where is man going to have this dominion? Not in the waters above the heaven, but in the fishes of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over everything, every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. So man is being made, right? Soon to be created, but God has declared that man will have dominion not in the waters above, but in the sea, in the air, and in the land or the earth below. That's what God has made or God has declared. Now, the next verse, verse 27. And I, God, created, there we go. Now he's been created. And this is what's interesting. When it's the animals and everything else, God the Father doesn't come down with Jesus to do this. He has the Savior do all the work. But when it comes to man, this is a dual effort by both of them, or at least they make the making and the creating are done together, right? So in verse 27, and I, God, created man in mine own image, and in the image of my only begotten created I him, male and female created I them. So this is a spiritual creation that is happening. This is spiritually being created after God had declared our making. And I, God, blessed them and said unto them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth, just like the animals, right? Who are up in the waters. They're in the spiritual realm. They're commanded to multiply and replenish the earth, the sea and the earth below. So it is with man. Man is commanded in the spirit world to be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth below, and to subdue it, and have dominion over fish of the sea, and fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. You notice the dominion is to be given when they come down to the sea, to the earth, and the air. Not in the spirit world above, but in the temporal world below. All right. So this is just reaffirmation on day 6, right? Where man's been made. And once again, the spiritual realms are the heavens above and the waters, and then the physical sphere is the heaven leading down to sea and earth. Right, we'll go through verses 29 through 31. And I, God, said unto man, behold, I have given you every herb bearing seed which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree in which shall be the fruit of a tree yielding seed to you, it shall be for meat. And to every beast of the earth, and to every fowl of the air, and to everything that creepeth upon the earth, wherein I grant life, You notice here it says, there shall be given every clean herb for meat, and it was so even as I spake. Though God is speaking here to Adam about the tree and the fruit and the seed and all the animals, he's speaking in perfect in the future tense. Shall, shall, these things shall happen. Because he hasn't formed anything physically. He's speaking to men and saying, I've given you everything, and everything that I'm giving you, eventually there's going to be a physical formation of things, and you shall have everything you need to be successful. And I, God, saw that everything that I had made, meaning everything he had declared from his mouth, right? And behold, all things which I had made were very good. And the evening and the morning were the sixth day. So we're done through the sixth day there. So that is pretty much the end of Genesis 1 slash Moses 1. There's more in Moses 1 that we didn't get into because there is um in Moses 2. So we're going to close out with this and what God gives Moses as a last declaration before he leaves. And then I think what we'll do is let's just do it. We'll go through the first few verses of Genesis 2 to kind of see how this conversation continues before we call it good. And then we'll circle back and continue the conversation of the creation account continuing. But in Moses 1:40 and 41, God tells Moses, and now, Moses, my son, I will speak unto thee concerning this earth upon which thou standest, and thou shalt write the things which I shall speak. So this is before God gives the creation account that we just covered, right? And why it's gone missing and why the Moses chapter 1 is important. It says, in a day when the children of men shall esteem my words as naught, and take many of them from the book which thou shalt write, behold, I will raise up another like unto thee, and they shall be had again among the children of men, among as many as shall believe. So as members of the church, we do talk about, we believe in the Bible as long as it's translated correctly, and that some of the pure and precious things of the doctrine of Christ and of God that have been lost from the Bible because of whether it's by design or just by the nature of the fallen world that we live in, these simple truths were lost, right? That many had thought that that was the New Testament, but it seems to be relatively clear that at least through these two verses that it is clearly referencing the Old Testament and the truths and the covenants that were stripped out of there. So with that being said, we're in day 6. We've kind of come to the end of Moses 2, Genesis 1, and we've already touched a little bit into it in talking about those verses that really re-emphasize the make, create, and formed um, godly creative pattern, which we kind of shared earlier what the thinking behind that was. And so that's where we are. Appreciate everyone's time. Appreciate all the support. Thank you to all those who made comments and shared their thoughts and the creations and the questions that were brought up. Uh, we'll be working, probably have another live digital kava session later this week. We'll talk about some other topics on Polynesian history. But as for today's spiritual live digital kava session, this is Tua Fale coming from Las Vegas, Nevada. And as always, we ask and share with all of our viewers, listeners, and those who join us during every live digital kava session is to be bold. Don't be afraid to ask the hard questions and to always, always stay curious. Peace.